This is Anastasia Grishman, a Russian gamer, model and tattoo artist who looked full of life. However, behind the screen, well, let's just say that things were a little different. And this is Anna Lejkovic. On Instagram, she appeared to be stylish, successful and living her best life. But what you're seeing here, that polished, curated version of herself, was actually nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. As you will see through these two stories, the reality behind these influencers is not actually glamorous. In fact, it's grotesque. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at two disturbing cases where online facades hid chilling realities. One of these stories is about a woman who vanished while her social media just seemed to keep on posting, and the other of a daughter who shocked the world when they realized what she was capable of. Actually, in hindsight, after researching both of these cases, I guess you could say that both of them started online but ended in bloodshed. Before we begin, if you enjoy true crime, strange or chilling stories, then please consider subscribing if you haven't yet, as I post up to twice a week. Oh, and if you're here for only one of the stories today, then I'll leave the timestamps here. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and get ready, because this is the case of Anna Lejkovic. Our first story today takes us to Eastern Europe, a region rich in history, shaped by shifting borders and filled with many cultures. We begin in the country of Moldova. With a population of only 2.5 million residents, Moldova might seem unassuming at first glance. However, it's a country that is filled with a deep sense of national pride. Despite facing long-standing economic and political challenges, it has a very vibrant culture, one that is influenced by both its Romanian roots and a unique blend of Latin and Slavic traditions. However, Moldova does struggle with the challenge of emigration, because as it turns out, more than a quarter of the country's population lives or works abroad. Even still, its global footprint reaches far beyond its borders, especially in the digital world. By the way, who remembers this old tune from the early 2000s? Ozone's Dragostei din Tei, which is better known as Numa Numa, is perhaps one of Moldova's most iconic tracks, with over 700 million views to this day, and of course still counting. Oh, and then there's Moldova's unforgettable Eurovision moment, Runaway. However, again, this is better known as the epic sax guy. The online world really is a strange place, but it's not going anywhere. At times, it can be brilliant and hilarious, but just as often, deceptive and even dangerous. If it's not trolls or negativity, it's stalkers or scammers, or even people digging through your personal info like it's some sort of public library. Because honestly, it is quite scary how much people can find out about you just simply by putting your name into Google. Have you ever wondered how scammers get your number, or why your inbox is filled with so many bloody annoying emails? Well, this is probably why. The world of the internet is far greedier than you may think. Data brokers love to sell your data to marketers and scammers without your consent, all in the name of profit. Meanwhile, they're making billions of dollars in the process. Now, technically, they are required to remove your data if you ask them to, but it's often rare to find them, and they intentionally make the process difficult for you. Googling myself comes up with all sorts of results, but what really bothers me is that when I type my personal email address into Google, there are many websites that hold my name, email, and various other details that are all at the ready for someone to buy. And seeing that made me feel quite violated, even unsafe. Which is what brings me to today's sponsor, Aura. Seriously, these guys do all of the heavy lifting when it comes to protecting your digital privacy. Basically automatically removing your personal info from all data brokers and then keeping it off. Now, personally, I believe that privacy is important, but in a world where we are infinitely connected to companies and corporations through the internet, it is almost impossible to protect my data alone. In fact, did you know that by the year 2030, the global data broker market is expected to hit more than $615 billion US? And that's why I chose Aura to help protect my data. But that is only the start. If you need a VPN, done. Want real-time fraud alerts? They have you covered. And if your personal info shows up on the dark web, they'll notify you right away. I'm not leaving myself exposed online, and you shouldn't either. So, if you want to try Aura for free for 14 days, go to aura.com/coffeehousecrime. In only 2 weeks, you'll see exactly where all of your data seems to be floating around online, and how Aura can help you get rid of it. That's aura.com/coffeehousecrime. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring today's video, and of course, thank you folks for listening. And now let's get straight back to this case. So, as you can probably tell already, not everything that comes from the internet is as harmless as a viral dancing video, and both of these stories serve as great examples. It was in December of 2020, and in the Moldovan city of Comrat, that police received a harrowing phone call. One that would lead them to a crime scene so gruesome and deeply disturbing that it would test even the most seasoned of officers. And, well, let's just say that it stood in complete contrast to the carefully curated image of the person who was actually at the center of it all. The phone call came from a young man in a state of absolute panic. His voice was frantic as he explained that his girlfriend had told him something so disturbing and outrageous that initially he actually thought she was joking. But the more that he thought about it, the more that it gnawed away at his conscience. And so, with it plaguing his mind, he decided to travel to her house while she was asleep in his bed. And unfortunately, what he found while there would confirm his biggest fears. As a result, he called the police immediately. And when officers arrived, nothing could have prepared them for what they were just about to walk into. Inside of the apartment was a scene that was so gruesome and deeply unsettling that several of the officers would later say it was the most horrifying crime scene they have ever witnessed. Lying in the middle of a blood-soaked room was the body of a woman. She had clearly been dead for multiple hours, and sadly, there was no chance of medical intervention. Her torso had been split wide open by a deep vertical wound, which ran down from the center of her chest through to her groin, and even more disturbingly, all of her organs had been scattered around her body. According to the investigators, the scene just defied all words, and the brutality that they had experienced was straight out of a horror movie. It didn't take long for officers to identify the victim as 40-year-old Praskovia Lejkovic, who happened to be the homeowner. So it turns out that Praskovia lived here with her 21-year-old daughter named Anna, who, by the way, was the girlfriend of the man who called the police merely hours prior. And based off of her recent confession, well, let's just say that officers were more concerned about their safety rather than hers. But before we get ahead of ourselves here, who precisely were Anna and Praskovia Lejkovic? Beginning with her mother, Praskovia was a devoted and loving parent. She gave birth to Anna when she was only 19 years old, and although her father, Vasily Aladov, was technically in the picture, he unfortunately was basically never present for her. You see, Vasily was a wealthy land and farm owner with many ambitions of his own, so much so that he even ran for governor of a local region in 2019. And although he would never succeed, his multiple business empire was successful enough to financially support the family. While money could never replace love or emotional connection, it did give Praskovia one crucial advantage here: the ability to raise her daughter in relative stability even as a single parent. As a result, Anna attended good schools, studied hard throughout all of her years in education, and eventually enrolled into university, where she studied medicine. And while we don't quite know which field she specialized in, one thing would soon become disturbingly clear: that Anna had a strong understanding of the human anatomy. And I'm not talking about the kind of knowledge that helps with good back rubs, but more the kind that knows how to remove your heart without flinching. Anna and her mother remained close while she grew up, but sadly, many changes happened throughout her teenage years. And, well, in this case, not many of them were good. Praskovia began to notice some disturbing patterns. To begin with, Anna had become obsessed with fashion and the finer things in life, which obviously is quite normal for a young girl. But having a father who only knew how to love her by throwing money at her, Anna very quickly became spoiled. Nowhere was this more obvious than on her social media. We're talking designer clothes, luxury vacations, and a flawless appearance, likely with the help of many filters. Throughout the years, she became increasingly obsessed with her appearance on Instagram, which at the time had amassed more than 6,000 followers. Obviously, these numbers aren't massive, but it was enough to make her feel like that she was gaining traction. Her Instagram feed was filled with snapshots of luxury, including Gucci and Prada outfits, poolside cocktails, and dozens of dazzling beaches all over Europe. It was a curated highlight of beauty, wealth, and status. And Anna would post frequently, showing the world only what she wanted them to see. Of course, that being that her life was apparently perfect. In the background, Anna dreamed of becoming an influencer, someone who could travel the world, collaborate with brands, and maybe even rub shoulders with the elite. A life that wasn't built on academics or hard work, but on image instead. Unfortunately, as she grew older, her obsession with social media grew. Meanwhile, her university studies slowly started to fall apart. After all, when you've been handed pretty much everything you've wanted in life, it is easy to forget the value of earning it. But academics was not the only thing that Anna was now neglecting, because behind the filters and edits, her party-fueled lifestyle had now given way to alcohol and drugs. And eventually, what started as the occasional Friday night drink would instead become the regular daily binge. While all of this was going on, her mother watched on in horror as she saw Anna slip deeper and deeper into the throes of addiction. But despite everything she tried to do to intervene, nothing seemed to get through. In fact, only 1 month before the tragedy, Anna would even suffer an overdose. After that incident, both her mother and grandmother desperately tried to help her. But Anna wasn't interested in changing, and whenever the topic seemed to come up, she would explode with anger and even vanish for days at a time. And then came December of 2020, and what once began as a beautiful relationship between a mother and her daughter had suddenly snapped into a brutal and chaotic scene. So, it's no surprise that after finding Praskovia's body and also becoming aware of the horrifying confession, detectives quickly pinned Anna as the main suspect. Now, naturally, the investigation began by reaching out to both friends and family, but strangely enough, nobody seemed to know where she had gone. In fact, her social media remained radio silent too, which only seemed to add more suspicion to the mix. It kind of looked like she was trying to disappear, but the thing is that Anna really did not have many places to run. However, as the hours turned into days, officers began to worry if maybe she had actually managed to slip away. There were search teams looking for her high and low throughout all hours of the day, but it appeared that maybe Anna was just as sneaky as she was dangerous. That would be until 3 days later, when Anna was finally found to be staying at a friend's apartment all along. And get this, but during the entire time, she didn't seem to be stressed at all. According to her friend, she was totally calm for all 3 days. In fact, she actually seemed cheerful. So after being tracked down, she of course was finally arrested on suspicion of murdering her own mother. But from this point on, her behavior would actually only get worse. From the very beginning, Anna didn't hold back. She openly admitted to the murder, without any hesitation, shame, or remorse. In fact, she apparently laid out all of the events in a calm and detailed manner, kind of like just going down to the shops to buy a pint of milk, instead of, you know, murdering your mother. According to Anna, it all began only a few days earlier, when her mother was actually away on a work trip in Germany. With the house to herself, Anna was now free to indulge in her usual habits. Of course, without the fear of being caught or judged. And obviously, I'm not talking about late nights and junk food, but drugs and alcohol. When Praskovia returned home on the night of December the 11th, she immediately sensed that something was off. Not only did she know her daughter very well, but she could also tell when Anna was completely whacked out on drugs. When Praskovia confronted her about it, Anna denied everything, and that is when the argument quickly spiraled. But the one thing to tip all of this over was absolutely pathetic. All Praskovia did was try to convince Anna that she needed to go to hospital, and apparently that was the breaking point in her mind. In a sudden drug-fueled rage, Anna stormed into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and then struck her mother in the chest. Praskovia collapsed to the floor, bleeding heavily. But Anna, she wasn't finished. What happened next can only be described as truly unthinkable. In a cold frenzy, and using the knowledge that she had learned from medical school, she began to dissect her mother while she was still alive. I'm going to avoid going into any graphic detail here, but as you know, one by one, she sliced her organs out of her body. And once Anna was done, well, she simply laid the knife aside and claimed that she felt nothing. No fear, no regret, not even sadness. Just nothing. And then she casually undressed, took a shower, did her makeup, and got redressed. Anna had plans to go out that evening, and so, after contacting her boyfriend, she left the property, bought a bottle of champagne, headed over to his place, engaged in sex, and then told him all about her evening. Now, at first, he didn't actually believe his girlfriend. I mean, who would anyway? Not only did her tone not match her words, but she sounded completely absurd. And so, he just brushed it off as some sort of sick joke. However, when he asked for more details, well, that is when she clammed up and refused to say any more. Later that night, and once Anna had finally fallen asleep next to him, that is when he decided to slip out of the house and check on Praskovia. And, of course, that was the moment that changed everything. In a blind panic, he then picked up his phone and called the police, but by the time he and the officers finally got back to his apartment, Anna was gone. Of course, before then being found 3 days later. After Anna's confession, the authorities had no doubt that she was responsible. As their sole suspect, officers made it crystal clear to the media, saying, Anna Lejkovic is the main suspect, and there is little to no likelihood of any other suspects. With her confession at hand, things moved quite swiftly, and only 24 hours after her arrest, she appeared in court. And this would be the first time that the world could see how vile and unremorseful she really was. Despite the cameras being pointed at her, Anna acted as though the entire ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience. She lounged on courtroom benches, casually picked at her fingernails, and even at one point pretended to take a nap. When the judge entered, Anna didn't simply stand up, she climbed onto the bench itself, almost as if this was just another classroom joke. And when she exited the courtroom, a journalist asked her, "Did you really kill your mother?" And her response, well, she smiled and then laughed, and with a light-hearted tone, simply said goodbye. Obviously, this erratic behavior, when paired with the sheer brutality of her crime, raised obvious concerns about her mental state. I mean, I don't think it takes a psychologist to assume that she is seriously effed in the head. Even the investigators were baffled. Her family and friends were just as equally stunned, with her uncle Vladimir telling the press, Praskovia loved her daughter so much. She spent as much time as she possibly could with her. It only took 2 hours for the police to tell me that Anna was the main suspect. I could not even imagine this. Alongside the obvious questions surrounding her mental health, there was one lingering mystery which no one could wrap their heads around. Of course, that being, what was her motive? Because this wasn't a stranger or someone who had wronged Anna, but her very own mother. The only person who had actually been there to support her from the very beginning. I mean, surely a disagreement over drugs couldn't actually push Anna into such a brutal rage, right? Well, some believe this wasn't actually just one single thing, but rather a combination of deteriorating mental health, heavy drug abuse, and untapped anger issues. And so, before any trial date was actually even considered, Anna was ordered to undergo a full psychiatric evaluation, of course to determine if she was actually fit to stand trial. The findings were disturbing, because although Anna was intelligent and outwardly appeared to function well within society, her emotional state was deeply fractured. It appeared that she lacked empathy and struggled to understand or relate to other people, and so, according to experts, it is unlikely that she fully grasped what she was doing that fateful night. Psychologists eventually concluded that Anna was not able to correctly perceive the circumstances which are important for a criminal case, therefore determining that she was unable to testify. The results of her evaluation came only weeks after the crime, and not only that, but the court seemed to be happy with it. That means that Anna will never actually face trial for the murder of her mother. And here's the part that raised a lot of eyebrows. But the time between confession to psychiatric diagnosis to final ruling was only 17 days. We may never know why things moved so quickly, but it is worth highlighting again that Anna's father is a wealthy and influential man in Moldova. So, it does kind of make you wonder, were a few strings maybe quietly pulled in the background? Rather than receiving any sort of prison time, Anna was deemed to be not criminally responsible for her actions, and so, on December the 28th of 2021, she was committed to a psychiatric institution, where, at least for now, she begins treatment for what was described as a severely disturbed mind. Naturally, this case made headlines across Moldova, and in a weird twist of fate, Anna's social media would eventually explode, doubling in size and peaking at over 15,000 followers before her accounts were eventually taken offline. And so, I guess in a way, Anna actually got what she had always wanted, that being fame. However, it wasn't really the kind she was hoping for, because this is infamy instead. What truly drove Anna to murder her mother may never actually be known, and with her mental state in such disarray, the motives may be buried so deep that she will never be able to explain them. However, there is one thing that is for certain here, that Praskovia absolutely adored her daughter. She was devoted, attentive, and wanted the very best for Anna. And yet, she was betrayed in the most horrific way possible. On the internet, Anna painted this glamorous lifestyle of success, wealth, and beauty. However, behind that mask, she was just another killer in the making. She wasn't just curating her image here, she was actually hiding a monster in plain sight. But it does make you wonder, what happens if the roles were actually reversed? I mean, in hindsight, it's now easy to look at Anna and see her as materialistic, vain, narcissistic, and completely unremorseful. However, our next case, things aren't so simple. And so, on that note, please grab yourself another coffee. This is the case of Anastasia Grishman. Shifting away from Moldova, we now head northeast to the largest country on Earth. A vast and complex land which is rich in culture, history, and haunting isolation. Of course, I'm talking about Russia. While Russia is often associated with grand architecture, classical art, and sprawling uninhabited wilderness, it is also known, particularly in recent years, as one of the world's most formidable political powerhouses. Today, we're narrowing our focus to the country's western edge and to the port city of St. Petersburg. It's a cultural capital nestled near the border of mainland Europe and a major gateway in and out of the nation. Now, thanks to its global significance and steady tourism, crime in St. Petersburg is actually relatively low, at least on paper. Apparently, most reported offences involve corruption or bribery, with violent crime rate far less common than you might expect. However, even murder still happens here. And on August the 9th, 2022, that horror would come knocking once again. Police initially became informed of this case by an unsettling call coming from a young woman. This person, whose identity still remains withheld for privacy, sounded distressed, frightened, and even worried for her friend's safety. According to her, something awful had happened. She had been told that her friend, named Anastasia, was dead and inside her own apartment. Now, at first, the story sounded too far-fetched to be true. However, what made her take it seriously was Anastasia's strange and unsettling behavior online in the days leading up to it. Something just didn't seem right, and so, too afraid to investigate alone, the caller then asked the police to meet her at the apartment to check in. And although the officers were understandably skeptical at first, what they were about to find on the morning of August the 10th would change everything. Upon arrival, officers cautiously stepped inside of the apartment and were immediately hit with the all-too-familiar stomach-turning smell. The place was an absolute mess, with clothes, bags, and personal belongings scattered haphazardly across the floor. They called out for Anastasia, however, there was no response. At first glance, the entire apartment seemed to be empty, but the further they ventured inside, the stronger that smell became. Following their noses, it eventually led them to the bathroom, and tragically, that is when they found her. Inside of the bathtub lay the lifeless body of a young woman who seemed to be submerged in a pool of dried blood, and based on the state of her body, it seemed that she'd been lying there for at least a few days. It also appeared that she had suffered at least 22 separate injuries, including 13 stab wounds to the head, neck, torso, and upper limbs. So it's no surprise that officers immediately ruled this to be a homicide, and based on how savage the attack was, it was clear that it was filled with severe emotional rage. After the crime scene had been secured by officers and forensics began their work, the body was then formally identified by her friends to be 26-year-old Anastasia Grishman. But before we dive into the investigation of her brutal murder, let's first look at who Anastasia really was. Because, as it turns out, her story holds a lot of hardship, resilience, and tragedy. Born on February the 7th, 1996 to her mother Elena, Anastasia experienced a hard life from the very beginning. Her father, who was a severe alcoholic, walked out just before Anastasia was born, leaving Alina to raise her daughter alone without any support or money. For the first few years, they would live in poverty, moving between hostels or sleeping on couches. Elena picked up work wherever she could find it, but that did mean that Anastasia was often left alone for long stretches of time, and by the time that she was actually old enough to speak, she was also learning how to survive. Anastasia cooked her own food, brushed her teeth without being taught, and learned how to navigate the world in ways that a child never should have to. When she was only 12 years old, her mother had to make the hard decision to send her to live with her grandparents in the nearby town of Kolpino, which is situated about 30 minutes outside of St. Petersburg. Although it was hard for Elena, it was actually a lifeline for Anastasia. She barely knew her grandparents, but they would check in from time to time, and Elena saw this as an opportunity for stability for her daughter. However, this move would come with a new kind of distance, and where Elena would see her daughter once every weekend, that eventually changed to once a month, and then ultimately nothing at all. You see, Elena was still busy chasing her own survival. She moved to other cities, took on more jobs, and then eventually remarried too. And that sense of abandonment left deep scars in Anastasia. As a teenager, she became both quiet and withdrawn, and that emotional pain began to manifest physically, as tragically, that is when she would develop an eating disorder. But the good news is that despite her mother deciding to step away, her grandmother decided to step up instead. She became the support that Anastasia so desperately needed, offering the one thing that she had long gone without. Of course, that being care. And not only would she help Anastasia through her disorder, but she would even nurture her creativity and give her the space that she needed to grow. And as it turns out, Anastasia was actually a very talented artist, and through her teenage years filled out many sketchbooks and canvases. And recognizing that creative fire inside of her, her grandmother tried to do everything she could to help that talent flourish. But Anastasia's art didn't stay confined to just paper or canvas, no. Her favorite medium was actually skin. Okay, maybe that sounded a little bit creepy when said out loud, but of course what I'm talking about here is tattoos. At only 15 years old, she asked her grandmother for her first tattoo, which, by the way, is 3 years before the legal age. And while most guardians would have likely said no, her grandmother didn't. What she saw instead was a young girl who was desperate for some sort of direction, and so she agreed. And together, she went with Anastasia to get her very first tattoo. That single moment seemed to spark something deep in Anastasia, because from that point onward, tattoos would not only be a hobby. They became a core part of her identity, and a driving force behind the life that she would build. By her late teens, Anastasia had turned her passion into a career. She landed an apprenticeship at a local tattoo parlor, all while juggling her studies in college, where she would take on courses in both computer programming and car mechanics. I mean, not only was she a tattoo artist and a petrol head, but a gamer and an entrepreneur too. Her abilities really did seem to be limitless. This is when her interests and personality began to shine through in her appearance. She started to dye her hair brightly, made bold fashion choices, and of course rocked both piercings and tattoos. And at the age of 16, Anastasia also stepped into the online world, joining VK, which is the Russian equivalent of Facebook. It is here that she would share the things that she loved the most, including anime, video games, fashion, makeup, and all things creative. Her posts seemed to have a spark to them, a kind of magnetic energy, so to speak, and her unique style, paired with her open personality, would help her quickly build a dedicated following. And then, in the year 2014, and at only 18 years old, she finally completed her studies. With an education and a growing fan base behind her, she moved back to St. Petersburg, determined to become a full-time professional tattoo artist. And she didn't just talk the talk here, because Anastasia really was her art. Her body was covered in tattoos, most of them which she actually inked herself. Of course, the only area left untouched was her back, for obvious reasons that she couldn't reach it. I mean, that would have been pretty impressive, but I wouldn't have put it past her. Branding herself as Grishman, she built herself a name from the ground up, and it didn't take long for her reputation to grow. Her social media absolutely exploded, and by 2019, at only 23 years old, she had more than 290,000 followers on TikTok, a huge number at the time, especially in Russia. Anastasia really was on her way to success. She was independent, creative, and steadily building the life that she not only wanted, but also deserved too. So, the question is, how did she go from thriving to lifeless in a bathtub? For those who knew Anastasia well, many realized that something seemed to be off in the days leading up to her discovery. For example, many of her recent posts just didn't seem to add up. A lot of the photos used were taken days or even weeks before, and the captions felt oddly unfamiliar. And as for all of her replies to her messages, well, they just seemed short, distant, and robotic. I mean, they genuinely felt like they had been written by another person, and many of her friends noticed this. Things took an even sharper turn when Anastasia's partner began to say some deeply unsettling things. Dmitry told people that Anastasia was extremely depressed, not just recently, but for the most of her adult life. Which, sadly, wasn't a surprise, because Anastasia had been quite open about that. But what did come next afterwards surprised them, because, according to him, Anastasia had once asked him that if she were to become too miserable, then she would like him to end her life instead. Which is odd, right? Now, at first, all of their friends told him to just shut up and stop making weird jokes, because surely no one would actually ever say that. However, Dmitry doubled down and said that Anastasia had basically been begging him to do it recently, because apparently she couldn't handle it anymore. He basically said that she wanted him to end her pain, and according to him, he actually did it. That is when her friends suddenly fell silent. Dmitry claimed that he had Anastasia at her request, and had done so a few days prior. But this bizarre, almost casual confession set off huge alarm bells amongst her friends. Understandably horrified, they called the police, and it was those tips that led them to the grim discovery. But who precisely was Dmitry Chernyshov? And how did he go from being a client to a killer? Well, as you can see from these photos, Dmitry had his own fair share of ink all over his body. It was around September of 2021 that he was in the market for a new tattoo. At the time, he was actually in another long-term relationship with a woman named Margarita. But after growing tired of being a basic pizza, Margarita decided it was time to spice things up with a fresh tattoo as her new topping of choice. She had heard of a new and upcoming artist in the St. Petersburg area, that of course being Anastasia, and so after getting her own tattoo, she then recommended her to Dmitry. In hindsight, I can promise you that she regretted that decision, and I am sure you can see where this is going. The nature of tattooing, especially for a large piece, means hours of sitting together, chatting and bonding, and with Dmitry's tattoo being a huge back piece, that is exactly what happened. While Anastasia worked on his design, the two discovered that they actually had a lot in common. They both loved alternative fashion, both shared a taste for the same music, both enjoyed anime and video games, and also were massive petrol heads. And perhaps even more crucially, both of them had lost their mothers at a young age, and that shared grief, also known as trauma bonding, and their overlapping interests formed a deep connection. And of course, from there, things began to blur. By the way, back to Margarita for a moment, but can you imagine having a tattoo from someone that you absolutely hate? That must suck. Anyway, Dmitry Chernyshov was born on February the 15th, 1998, making him physically 2 years younger than Anastasia and probably mentally a few years younger too. During his childhood, he was lovingly raised by both of his parents, but sadly that wouldn't last very long. When Dmitry was still a child, his mother tragically passed away, which unfortunately marked the beginning of major shifts in his life. His father eventually remarried, but for Dmitry, it only added more confusion and distance. He was described as a quiet, introverted kid and someone who mostly kept to himself. And as he entered his teenage years, he began to close himself off from the rest of the world around him, instead deciding to retreat into the digital one. Online, Dmitri found space to express his thoughts, often through poetry, but his writing seemed to have a much darker edge, as a lot of it centered around death, isolation, and pain. So, looking back into his teens, there were clear signs of a morbid fascination. However, there were other red flags too, because it seems that his social media was filled with misogyny, and he would often post things like girlfriend requirements, which included strict weight limits and appearance-based criteria. And honestly, I don't know who he thought he was. By the time he reached adulthood, Dmitri had already found himself in trouble with the law twice, racking up 2 criminal charges, including theft and evading military service. You see, military service is actually mandatory for all young Russian men, and dodging it isn't merely frowned upon, it's actually a criminal offense. And by the way, it comes with real-life consequences too, including a ban on leaving the country. But of course, he didn't actually tell Anastasia any of that. Instead, he would talk about his income and that he worked in IT, namely in programming and web design, which technically is true. But it turns out this was not actually his main source of income, because Dmitri had a second and far more controversial profession. I'm gonna give you a couple seconds to guess what it possibly could be here. But as it turns out, Dmitri was actually making Onlyfans content with his then girlfriend Margarita. Oh boy, we really are talking about Onlyfans again, aren't we? Now again, in Russia, pornography is quite literally outright illegal. Not just the production of it, but even the consumption. And so you can likely imagine that if you were to make this sort of content and then try to sell it, it is literally punishable by jail time. Now, of course, that doesn't stop many people, and for Dmitri, it merely meant living a double life. One wrong move, however, and he could end up behind bars. But Anastasia, she didn't mind. Anyway, over the course of these tattoo sessions, the two bonded quickly, exchanging phone numbers, messaging online, and then even hanging out at local car meets. Their connection deepened, and before long, things began to take a rather romantic turn. Unsurprisingly, Margarita was very unhappy by this. She began to suspect that something was going on, and their relationship would rather quickly turn toxic. And while Dmitri didn't seem to care about Margarita or her distress, Anastasia surprisingly did. Not long after that, things between Dmitri and Margarita officially ended, and then Anastasia stepped into her place. The pair made their relationship public, and from that moment on, their lives became increasingly intertwined. For better, or more accurately, worse. After that, Dmitri quickly slipped into the role of being her manager, handling Anastasia's business in the background. By now, she had amassed almost 300,000 followers on Instagram and TikTok, and had a steady list of clients at the tattoo parlor to boot. Overwhelmed by the success that she was finding, Dmitri took over. He scheduled her posts, managed her brand deals, scheduled her bookings, and helped create content. Now, on the surface, things looked good. However, they were also moving very quickly, because only 5 months into the relationship, and in February of 2022, they decided to get married. But soon after tying the knot, things began to change. As you may remember, Dmitri liked to film adult content. However, with Margarita now out of the picture, well, he needed a new partner. And surprisingly, that is when Anastasia decided to step into the role. Despite the illegal connotations behind it, she actually seemed quite unbothered. In fact, she would even agree to go on national television to talk about this new career path, appearing on a Russian talk show called Beyond the Edge. Think Dr. Phil or the Jeremy Kyle show, but with even fewer boundaries. She approached this episode as some sort of opportunity and a chance to talk openly about her choices in life and confront the stigma head-on. However, the producers had other plans, and from the moment that she walked on stage, well, it was clear that she had been set up. The tone was accusatory, and all of the questions seemed to be hostile. Not only that, but the hosts painted her as a tattooed rebel who was spiraling out of control, and to make matters even worse, they brought back up. Multiple psychologists were invited to assess her live on air, and then, as if the drama needed one final twist, Anastasia's mother had been secretly invited on too. All of a sudden, Anastasia was exposed not only to the entire country, but to her very own mother. But this was not a fair reflection of her, and the television producers had distorted her into an entirely different person. Even before she stepped on stage, the damage had already been done, because it turns out that the host had preemptively interviewed her mother, and when asked what she thought about her daughter's career, well, she was disappointed to say the least. And look, I know that some of us won't actually agree with her choices anyway, but it was very clear that the moment Anastasia stepped on stage, she wasn't there to be heard. She was merely there to be judged and ridiculed. Surrounded by loaded questions and mockery, she became defensive quite quickly. I mean, who wouldn't anyway? She could quite literally see the trap that she had walked into. However, the real blow was still yet to come. Moments later, out walked Margarita. And let me tell you, she was not a happy pizza. She claimed that not only had Dmitry used her, but now was doing the same thing to Anastasia. And to inflame the situation even more, she also claimed that he pressured all of his partners into sex work for his own gain. And Margarita wasn't done yet. She accused him of physical abuse, including both hitting and even strangling her during the relationship. Honestly, the entire episode was a train wreck, and probably exactly what the producers had hoped for. There was drama, scandal, and anger, all at the expense of real people and their reputations. And the worst part of all of it was that no one stopped to think about the fallout, because only 3 months after this episode aired, Anastasia Grishman was dead. Now, much like our previous case, there was only one real suspect in mind, of course that being Dmitry. The authorities began by questioning Anastasia's friends, and they claimed that when they talked to Dmitry about it, he begged them not to go to the police and promised that he was going to sort it. Now, to be honest with you, I have no idea how that excuse could make anyone turn around and simply say, okay, but apparently it worked. However, here's the thing. Only a couple days after saying this, he then quietly renewed the lease on the apartment that he shared with Anastasia. So, if his plan really was to just disappear, then why lock in another year of rent? Oh, and also, let's not forget that Dmitry couldn't actually leave the country, and so any hope of him running away was essentially zero. And so, the great manhunt for Dmitry finally began. However, it wouldn't actually take long for officers to find him, because the next day, they found him in a hotel only 30 minutes from the apartment. After being arrested, Dmitry was both quick to defend himself and to throw Anastasia under the bus. He claimed that not only had she grown distant, but also close to someone new, that being a fellow TikToker named Kirill. Although there is no evidence to prove that this was anything more than a friendship, it is true that the two were spending a lot of time together. She had also confided in Kirill about the strain in her relationship, and that she had plans to escape. Drawing from her love of Asian culture, she had actually began to prepare to move to South Korea, quietly selling off all of her belongings, including her cars, and building a secret bank account. And by the way, all of this was without Dmitry's knowledge. However, what Dmitry did notice was her growing infatuation with Kirill, and from what investigators have gathered, that ignited a deep, burning jealousy. I mean, basically, he got angry at his own medicine. Anyway, this bozo claimed that Anastasia had asked him to end her life, but the evidence did not support this, and besides, even if it had been the case, it is still illegal. I could also tell you his own version of what happened that fateful night in detail, but honestly, it's sloppy drivel that does not deserve the light of day. What you do need to know is that during the time that his girlfriend lay dead in the bathtub, Dmitry continued to run all of her accounts and message people to buy himself time. He would even pretend to be her and message Kirill to say that she was breaking up with him, simply so he could rewrite his own pathetic story. The good news is that it took only 5 months to build a case against Dmitry, and in January of 2023, he finally went on trial, and without any reasonable defense, he pleaded guilty. And unfortunately, here comes the bad news. How do you think Russia punishes a man who murdered his wife? Well, in Dmitry's case, he received a horrifying 8 years behind bars. For context, we've seen plenty of Americans go to prison for longer than 8 years simply for selling domestic quantities of weed. And here's another example, but in Saudi Arabia, a journalist was sentenced to 10 years behind bars and 1,000 lashes simply for debating Islamic religion on an online blog. However, apparently, in Russia, murder is way less punishable. Allegedly. The silver lining here is that he'll be staying at IK3, also known as Polar Wolf, and Polar Wolf is known to be one of the most brutal gulags in the entire country. Temperatures here can drop as low as -30 degrees Celsius or -22 Fahrenheit. The prison has no central heating, and to rub salt into the wound, many of the prison cells have radiators painted on the walls. With unsanitary conditions, frequent beatings, and food more bland than a Zoom meeting about beige paint, this prison is seriously brutal, with inmates being made to walk outside in the cold for hours in little clothing, sometimes even none. So, while Dmitry was only sentenced to 8 years behind bars, those 8 years will likely be nothing short of hell, and there is every chance that he won't be the same man who first walked through those gates. Even so, no amount of suffering on Dmitry's part can ever make up for what he did, because nothing will be able to bring Anastasia back to the life that she was only just beginning to build. It's obvious that she had already been looking forward to a fresh start away from Dmitry. She had dreamed of living abroad and even opening her own tattoo parlor in South Korea, because before him, that was what she loved to do. She was an artist, and even in her darkest moments, that is what gave her joy. Yes, she was struggling with her mental health, but she was working on it and rebuilding and slowly making her way back to, well, just being Anastasia again. But now that journey has been stolen from her, and she will never get the chance to grow into that person that she was finally becoming. And so, on that rather heavy note, I think it's time to bring today's video to a close. Although both of these cases took place in the same corner of the world and featured people living in eerily similar lifestyles, the outcomes could not have been any more different. And it really makes you think about how the online world actually can shape someone's fate, or twist it entirely. Anyway, thank you so much for watching today, folks, especially if you made it this far. And if you have any thoughts or opinions on these cases, I'd love to know what you think down below. I try to read as many comments as possible. If you want to try Aura for free for 14 days, go to aura.com/coffeehousecrime. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring today's video, and of course, thank you folks for listening. I'm back again soon for another case, but until then, please make sure to look after yourselves and each other. And of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.